Okay, and we're live. People should trickle in over the next minute or so, I think. Hi, Sarah. No, I can't see you, but thanks for coming. Okay. So just to double check, everyone can hear me, right? I'm broadcasting. Fantastic. Yep. Okay, well, good. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for attending this panel. My name is Paul Kreitman, and I teach Japanese history at ELAC, Department of East Asian Language and Cultures here at Columbia and at the Weatherhead. And I have the honor to host this really exciting panel on Japan, parasitology, and framing developmental ambitions with this all-star cast who you can see lined up before you. So the origins of this panel are a little bit convoluted, but I think John and Alex and I invited me to moderate or discuss a panel at AAS they put together on a very similar theme, which I immediately left the chance to do because it intersected quite closely with my own research, to plug a piece I did on history of excrement, the attack by excrement in environmental history a few years back. So I loved reading the pieces and discussing, giving my thoughts. And those of you who attended AAS may have already attended quite similar presentations, but we thought, seeing as we put this all together, it was a great kind of topic, we can do a do-over and update people on progress and kind of present it in a different forum here at Weatherhead for people who couldn't make it to AAS. And rather than just me give my own stale thoughts once more, I thought we'd get someone else, and so Simon has kindly offered to bring his fresh perspective. So if you did attend the AAS panel, the presentations will be somewhat similar, but please hang around or come back for the second half where we'll have Simon's comments and hopefully a much, fresher and more animated and real-time discussion than was allowed for by the AAS asynchronous format. So that's kind of what's going on here. I will first of all introduce everyone in turn and then hand over to Alex, then John, then Aya, then Simon, so we can have things moving along fairly smoothly after that. So first up, we have Professor Alex Bay, Associate Professor and Department Chair at the History Department at Chapman University, who has published many things. I'm just going to mention some of the highlights for everyone here, actually. So his book, Berry in Modern Japan, came out in 2012 with University of Rochester Press about, I forgot, what's the subtitle, Alex? Remind me. I haven't got it here. But,
what is the what?
The subtitle of the book?
Making a National Disease.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. That was 2012. He also published an article entitled Disease, Environment and Causation, Roundworm Prevention and Eradication in 20th Century Japan. That was in Historia Scientiarum in 2018. And another article, Disciplining Shit, in Japan Forum in 2019. These latter pieces, I think, are part of a larger book project in progress with the provisional title Nation from the Bottom Up forthcoming. So keep an eye out for that. Next up, we have John DiMoia, Associate Professor. Has that been news since then, John? Is that your, I heard news.
Sorry, I'm just unmuting. I got full September 1st, so very nice. I'm a professor now. I'm not sure what that
Congratulations.
means.
Okay, full professor, John DiMoia at Seoul National University in the Department of Korean History. Key publications include Reconstructing Bodies, Biomedicine, Health and Nation Building in South Korea with Stanford in 2013. He also co-edited, along with Hiromi Mizuno and the late, great Aaron S. Moore, a volume, Engineering Asia, Technology, Colonial Development and the Cold War Order, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2018. He also, I should say, co-authored an article with another of our panelists, with Aya, Integrating Parasite Eradication with Family Planning, the Colonial Legacy and Post-War Medical Cooperation in East Asia, which was in the Social History of Medicine last year. And his new project, Peace and Construction, South Korean Developmentalism, Built Environment in Southeast Asia, 1954 to 1980s, is coming along the pipe as well, I believe. Third up, we have Dr. Aya Homei, lecturer in Japanese studies at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at University of Manchester, who, along with the article with John I just mentioned, has also authored various pieces. I have here Hoi Young Kim, hope I'm saying that right, Doctors of Empire, Medical and Cultural Encounters Between Imperial Germany and Meiji Japan, also in Social History of Medicine in 2018. Birth Control Survey Research, Technical Bureaucrats and the Imagining of Japan's Population, 1945 to 1960, which came out last year in Japan Forum. Her book, Science for Governing Japan's Population, is due out next year with Cambridge University Press, as is a special issue co-edited with Professor Yoko Matsubara in Japan Forum on critical approaches to reproduction and population in post-war Japan, which should be out by the end of this year, inshallah. Finally, as a discussant, we have Dr. Simon Toner, who is lecturer in modern American history at the History Department of University of Sheffield, who has published a few different things. I'm going to mention some of the most relevant ones. Imagining Taiwan, the Nixon Administration, the Developmental States, and South Vietnam's Search for Economic Viability, 1969-1975, which is in diplomatic history. Also in 2019, and I think most relevant to today's topic, The Paradise of the Latrine, American Toilet Building and the Continuities of Colonial and Post-Colonial Development in Modern American History, which was 2019, yes. And his current book project is examining the final years of the American War in Vietnam as an episode in the history of global development. Incredibly topical in a quite sinister way, I fear. In particular, it shows how changes in global development thinking and practice in the late 1960s and 70s shaped debates within and between the allied US and South Vietnamese governments and had a decisive impact on the course and outcome of the war. Okay, that's enough from me. I've talked long enough. I will now, without further ado, turn it over to Alex to tell us all about shit.
And other things.
And other things, sorry.
Traveler approaching Kofu in Yamanashi Prefecture by train can visually appreciate the expression bonchi, or low-lying area. Kofu is situated at the confluence of 3 rivers, and this environment with rice paddies and flood-prone low-lying areas next to rivers was superb habitat for a snail important in the life cycle of the parasite that causes schistosomiasis. In a human or animal host, these flatworms mate and produce eggs. Most are passed with feces into the environment, but some eggs remain in the body and cause the classic symptoms of schistosomiasis, anemia, malnutrition, underdevelopment, dysentery-like diarrhea, liver and spleen psoriasis, and abdominal dropsy. Once the eggs reach water through open defecation or night soil used as fertilizer in rice paddies, they morph and find this snail. Having gestated in the snail, the parasites emerge in rice paddies, irrigation ditches, or slow-moving streams and find a new host to infect. The parasitic flatworm is dependent on the snail as an intermediary host. It shares a habitat with the snail, and these areas become known for their local disease. Endemic areas were also famous for producing men who could not pass the army physical examination. The presence of schistosomiasis associated Japan with other third world tropical disease hotspots. Japanese doctors referred to their country as a nation of parasites. Nation making and empire building, as well as notions of hygienic modernity, required schistosomiasis prevention and eradication. Japanese doctors imagined a total war against parasites in snails. During World War II, Japan waged total war in Asia and the Pacific that required the deployment of all resources against the enemy. The economy, the social and political body, and culture had to be mobilized. Borrowing the motif of total war, I suggest we see the battle against schistosomiasis as a case of total prevention. The Yamanashi case study is about building anti-schistosomiasis networks, engineering the environment, and changing local culture. During the 20th century, doctors and public health officials connected the science and imperial universities to doctors in the clinic revealed the relationship between disease and human waste, highlighted snail habitat in rice paddies, critiqued rural society, reformed the environment, and coupled disease prevention with the economy and with national strength. I call this total prevention. The main challenge, to borrow an expression from Bruno Latour, was getting the network to hold together. In 1931, Dr. Saito Minami wondered if the three challenges of lack of funds, lack of knowledge at the local level, and lack of ability to successfully take on such a large-scale natural enemy could be simultaneously tackled without crapping out halfway through. His prediction was spot on. In medical publications between the First and Second World Wars, doctors debated the best means for prevention and argued the merits of eradicating snails in the wild versus killing parasite eggs and feces. Many doctors saw the challenges of environmental engineering as less daunting than the prospects of rural social engineering. In the field, early prevention efforts focused on anti-snail campaigns. Starting in 1925, the Yamanashi Prefecture Hygiene Bureau would hire 60 to 70 people from the afflicted areas as an eradication crew to spread lime over 400 to 800 hectares of snail habitat. When the work was finished, the crew was dismissed. The trickle-down potential of these efforts did not lead to proactive local projects. And as soon as the prefectural authorities left, their anti-snail or anti-schistosomiasis campaigns came to a halt. Public health officials carried out education campaigns with similar results. The earliest extant popular prevention book was I Am a Local Disease Professor, a talk on Japanese schistosomiasis, published in 1917 for use in Kofu. Here it is important to note, with a bit of historical irony, that farmers had to be educated about their local disease. A top-hatted professor finds two schoolboys wading in a stream. He pulls them out and asks the kids if they ever heard of the local disease at school. Nope, they said. What about parasites? No. Okay, how about snails? Ever see one? No. Well, then no doubt you've never heard of schistosomiasis, right? I didn't think so. The professor in short order explains parasites and the local disease. He then asks them to imagine what would happen if out of 100 locals, 60 were afflicted with these parasites. What if a single village or even a single household carried it at this rate? Quote, there would be few people able to work and the village or house would become poor. It would not be just the village or house that would be poor. It would be the nation of Japan that would be poor. On top of that, our countrymen would get sick. Their bodies would waste away. Strong soldiers would disappear and we would become a weak nation. Therefore, local diseases are poor country, weak army diseases. If this disease spreads, the country will become poor and weak and we will not be able to fight wars against Germany or China. From the text, we can infer that rural society had little understanding of public or private health issues related to schistosomiasis. And in the field, doctors uniformly lamented the cultural level of farmers and their lack of concern for parasite disease. If the people had no sense of what hygiene was, well-laid plans for parasite disease prevention based on the spread of education and hygiene ideology would come to naught, Dr. Okada Ryoichi argued in 1931. Social reform was necessary, and quote, open defecation must be outlawed to facilitate toilet reform, end quote. Addressing the shift in hygiene consciousness at the rural level, Okada called for the masses to be taught from the bottom up. Part of the bottom-up anti-parasite campaign consisted of toilet technology change. Since the life cycle of the disease was extremely environmental, eradication efforts focused on killing eggs in night soil as well as killing snails in nature. Chemicals could have been added to latrines to kill eggs, but this would have hurt the value of night soil as fertilizer. Public health technocrats invented a new toilet to assure that prevention was sustainable. Night soil research revealed that if human waste was stored for over 100 days, anaerobic bacteria broke down organic matter by creating an oxygen-deprived environment that killed any and all disease-causing bacteria and parasite eggs. Dr. Takano Rokuro developed the home ministry style reform toilet that was designed to kill microorganisms in raw sewage. Takano wrote that, quote, because Japan modernized its hygiene while ignoring night soil treatment, and because it is the custom to use night soil as fertilizer, the main point of the reform toilet is to hygienically dispose of human waste input. And the way that this reform toilet worked is the fifth chamber on the right. By the time human waste reached that, all disease-causing bacteria and parasite eggs would have been killed, and it would have been safe to use as fertilizer. Okabe Hiroyuki, an instructor at hygiene at Kyoto Imperial University, participated in a June 1937 field study that revealed snail habitat was still quite large in Kofu, and the number of locals who understood schistosomiasis was rather small. Schistosomiasis morbidity was 25.4%. Okabe recorded that, quote, the local villagers really have no sense concerning snails. When we are collecting them, the villagers look on with interest, but they do not collect snails, even though they see us doing it. As we connect snails, many villagers pass by with indifference. We ask them about wearing long rubber boots. They respond, we never wear those. We ask school kids about snails and Japanese schistosomiasis, but they have absolutely no understanding. The villagers think that because the prefecture runs disinfection campaigns, that's enough. They know the name local disease, but they lack any real knowledge. Oral history recorded in Yamanashi also confirms a general lack of understanding of the local disease. In 1935, Kanimaru Tsuneno married into a farming family in Yatsutamura when she was 22. She fell ill in 1938. Her main symptoms were feeling lethargic and bloody stools. But she recalled at the time she had no idea what was wrong. Her in-laws did not help either. Only later did a relative tell her that she had the local disease and that she needed to go to Dr. Sugiura Saburo in the neighboring village because he was the best at curing it. Sugiura treated her with 30 shots of Stibinol, the main schistosomiacide at the time. The treatment was painful and it required recovery time between shots. In the post-war era, schistosomiasis experts worked to connect their local prevention networks with larger national interests of rebuilding Japan. In 1948, the leaders of 58 towns, cities, and villages joined with doctors and local assemblymen to form the Yamanashi Local Disease Prevention Eradication Union. The organization's job was to facilitate the spread of information, help carry out eradication, and co-fund prefectural projects. One of its members, Dr. Sugiura Saburo, ran a hospital in Kofu that specialized in treating the local disease. As an expert clinician and local elite, Sugiura used his position to spread knowledge about schistosomiasis. Oh, sorry. On Culture Day, November 3rd, 1951, Sugiura and two school children read a script concerning local disease prevention on the Kofu radio broadcasting station. In the script, the doctor asks why they called it a local disease, and the boy answers, because it's a disease limited to particular areas like Yamanashi or Shizuoka Prefecture. The girl adds, Yamanashi is said to have the world's highest incidence rates. Sugiura asks if they learn about parasites in school. The girl answers in the affirmative. Sugiura asks how to avoid getting the disease. The girl responds, by not going into water, I think. Sugiura replies, if you do not go into water, then you should be able to avoid this disease. But what about the farmers who work in the water, who work in flooded rice paddies and irrigation ditches? The larger point is that to avoid this disease, parasite eggs should not be passed. That is it important to completely cure this disease? The boy asks if getting rid of all the snails would be the ticket. Sugiura says, exactly. The prefecture applies chemicals to kill them, or it paves rivers with concrete so they cannot live there. The boy mentions that night soil is dangerous and that this is a big problem for farmers. Sugiura responds, there has been and there currently is much research on some method to kill all the parasites in night soil. But if you let night soil ferment at a high temperature, the eggs will die. The boy notes that if all the snails die, they can play in the water during the summer without fear. The girl adds then that farmers would not have to worry either. Sugiura concludes with a speech. You are correct. At any rate, because of this disease, we are despised by the people from other prefectures. If we do not do something to stamp this disease out, it will be to the great shame of the prefecture. Because of the damage to health, both strength and money are lost. This is a big deal. Every year we use the nation's money, 5 million yen, to kill snails. Therefore, we need cooperation and effort to quickly cast out this disease from our prefecture. End quote. Despite Sugiura's efforts, rural people still lack knowledge about schistosomiasis. Sasamoto Kayo went to Yatsutamura in 1959 as a 20-year-old bride. After working in the rice paddies, she fell ill. When interviewed in 1979, she recalled having absolutely no understanding of this disease. It was unbearable, she cried. No one in my husband's family ever said, maybe it's the local disease. A neighboring auntie visited later and asked her about her symptoms. It must be the local disease, she said. You had better go see the doctor. Kayo got checked by the village doctor. He examined her stool and said that he had never seen so many eggs before. After showing her a slide under the microscope, he said, you're done for if you don't get treatment. Kayo received approximately 25 shots of Stivino. Part of the post-war total prevention campaign leveraged the influence of mass media to take the fight against the parasite and snail to the workspaces and classrooms of the people. In 1947, the city parked a parasite train at Kofu Station. It had a car dedicated to pathology research and one for fecal exams, as well as microscopes on display to show parasite eggs and slides and the like. In the 1950s, local governments ran prevention cars. A bus decorated with signs reading, to prevent the local disease, let's eliminate snails, and equipped with speakers to deliver the message to those within earshot. Yamanashi Governor Amano Hisashi participated in these events himself in 1955. Yamanashi had been laying concrete and irrigation ditches to destroy snail habitat from the 1950s. Concrete irrigation ditches were part of disease prevention couched in terms of agrarian reform and progress. In 1958, the prefecture set up the Total Farming Management and Local Disease Policy Committee. Promotional flyers called for locals to eliminate the local disease and build a bright, healthy life, reform agriculture, and build an affluent life. By combining agricultural reforms with prevention, this body carried out wastewater construction works, built infrastructure that changed the environment of arable land, and supported the switch from grain to fruit tree cultivation. The prefecture, along with the local towns, proactively turned rice paddies into peach and grape orchards to eliminate snail habitat. By 1968, epidemiologists reported that total prevention was working. Doctors Ijima Ito and Ishizaki wrote that, quote, it is generally believed that a considerable reduction of human schistosomiasis in Japan has been brought about by the use of molluscicides, modification of snail habitat by cementing ditches, rapid development in the agricultural method, and industrialization of the endemic areas, end quote. In 1977, only 3 patients still remained in Yamanashi. The incidence rate had dropped from 5.47% in 1946 to 0.03% in 1977. The overarching aim of prevention during the 20th century was to disrupt the life cycle of schistosomiasis. I am a local disease professor was a window into the rural society during the Taisho period that prevention campaigns hoped to reform. Okabe Hiroyuki's 1937 report revealed agriculturalists had no interest in proactively addressing the cause of the local disease, and oral history accounts show the agrarian sector had little understanding of schistosomiasis. Dr. Sugiura's 1951 radio broadcast articulated a number of points that public health officials hoped were common sense. Again, interviews from former patients who contracted the local disease in the late 1950s suggest that education was slow to diffuse the popular understanding of health and hygiene. In conclusion, how was total prevention achieved? Doctors and public health technocrats had to transform and negotiate with the natural and human environments to make the network of prevention hold together. As parasitologists extended medical and scientific knowledge out into social practice, they had to accommodate the local agricultural ecosystem and the local agrarian society. Doctors wanted to remake both, yet scientific knowledge only slowly diffused to the agrarian population. Excuse me. Alliances were made between public health officials and agricultural technocrats. The 100-year-long effort was cumulative, and I'm speculating a bit here. I'm sorry, the 100-year-long effort was cumulative, but when snail habitat was reworked to benefit both farming and disease prevention, and here's where I'm kind of speculating, this was the carrot that made farmers tolerate the stick of disease prevention. In the end, the cost of total prevention was the destruction of local environments. In 1972, 15-year-old middle school student Kitami Chieko from Sado Island off the coast of Niigata Prefecture wrote to the Yomiuri Shimbun to complain about the loss of the natural environment. The prefecture had recently cemented the banks of the local river. The habitat for fireflies, purple lilies, dayflowers, rice fish, and tadpoles had all been destroyed. The area where kids played in the river during the summer was also gone. Chieko understood that the cemented river helped agriculture and prevented flooding, but she still didn't like it. Another young reader from Yamanashi, the 13-year-old middle school student Nagata Kiyomi, responded to Chieko's letter. Kiyomi wrote, "Miss Kitami of Niigata, I also do not care for the cemented rivers, but where we live, we have Japanese schistosomiasis, a fearful local disease. This parasite lives in the snails, and the snail lives in stagnant water and mud. It can't be found in steady flowing streams. They made cement rivers called local disease eradication canals to improve the flow. Because of this, there are no more fireflies, but I think it's better than getting the local disease. We still have people dying from it. There aren't fireflies around the house, but lotus and sunflowers bloom in the spring. We can hear the bush warbler calling from the shrine forest. We hear frogs and rice paddies. In the fall, crickets chirp to the point of being clamorous. What is most distasteful, though, is that the main highway passes through our neighborhood." These middle schoolers clearly understood the environmental losses related to development benefited local society. For the cost of summer swim spots or local firefly populations, they recognized the benefits of flood control and disease prevention. They also understood that the loss of habitat and their childhood interactions with nature was the price that local areas paid for national progress. 50 years later, the campaign against schistosomiasis in Kofu is barely remembered. Tucked away in a neighborhood on the east side of the Kamanashi River is Dr. Sugiura's original clinic, now turned a museum. Across the river from the museum, in rice fields of the Kami-ima Suwa area, one can occasionally find overgrown ditches that were laid during the eradication campaigns of the late Showa era. Today, if you asked what Kofu is famous for, many would simply say grapes. Buried beneath concrete rivers, filled in rice paddies turned fruit orchards and prefectural highways is a history of environmental and cultural change aimed at preventing the local disease dating back to the Meiji period. Thank you.
Okay, are we going directly with Q&A or are we going directly to me? Okay, let me get my PPT up.
Sorry about that, guys. My internet dropped out. But until I caught almost all of it. Thank you so much. If it goes again, and the veneer professional is kind of crumbling here, but we're having engineering done on the Wi-Fi here. We thought we'd fixed it, but clearly we haven't completely. But if it goes again, I do apologize. But over to you, John.
Okay, thanks. Perfect. And it gave me a leeway. I've almost got my PPT up. Okay, here we go. Share screen. Okay. All right, you guys should be seeing my slides, and I'll go into slideshow. From the beginning. There we go. Okay, can everyone, oh, that's not my first slide. Go back. Okay. Thanks very much. And you should be seeing my slides. And if you can't hear me, wave and some perfect. Thanks very much to Weatherhead and Paul for organizing, Alex and Aya and Simon for all being here. Very quickly, I'm John DiMoia. I'm a professor of Korean history at Seoul National University, and I am currently a visiting scholar at UCLA 2122 at the Center for Korean Studies. Actually, listening to Alex's talk, there's a lot of familiar material and interesting because there is late 60s in particular Japanese-Korean collaboration. I don't talk a lot about that, but I'm just mentioning here to highlight it. And a lot of that I think will come up in Aya's talk as well. What I'm going to be talking about is South Korean malaria programs, in particular, what's called the NMES, or the National Malaria Eradication System, from the late 50s through the early 1970s. And I'm going to be talking about this very much in its success narrative form, but then I'll try to hint, particularly in the second part of the talk, about exactly why there are problems with that success narrative, particularly because it links to the Korean effort in Vietnam as part of supporting the American war effort. And of course, what I'll end up with is what I'm really interested in now, which is Korean developmentalism, in which my interest is very formative, but I'll try to raise questions about this success narrative there as well. Okay, to start off then, what I'm going to be talking about with this program is the perception post-Korean War in 1954 that malaria had always been an endemic problem, but that it was now perceived as having reached epidemic proportions. And this is a particular constructed narrative. We'll talk about how it gets there. This effort was supported very much by the WHO. That's where many of these documents will be coming from. And also the American military assistance program, because the American military presence, as it is today, was very heavy in South Korea after the Korean War. So in some ways, probably some of the international attention that came to this program came through the American military complaining about malaria, rather than the voices of Korean villagers who were probably, somewhat less important to the Korean government at this time. Okay, so that perception that I just said of framing the problem as having gone from endemic to epidemic, just a little imagery to give you a feeling of what Koreans might have seen, whether medical professionals or the average person. On the left, highlighted in red, the portions of the southern half of the Korean peninsula that were perceived to have the highest incidence of malaria, which in this case was, I believe, almost exclusively Vivox malaria. And on the right, a wonderful stamp, if you read the Korean Malaria Pangyo Undong, anti-malaria prevention, officially 1962. But what I'll talk about in the next slide or two is the sort of run-up campaign in 59, when they're doing kind of demo programs in villages. Something else as I was prepping for this last night, just a reminder, is that weirdly, there aren't many posters for the anti-malaria campaigns. And anyone who knows Korea knows that rural Koreans were inundated with family planning and general anti-parasite posters by 1965. So I don't know whether I'm just missing those materials or whether they just weren't, it wasn't yet in the consciousness, but I found that kind of interesting. Lots of stamps, very little sort of ephemera, the type of materials you would normally find. Okay, and one more slide before I get into a little bit of specifics. Again, just to give you an image of the campaign, both in a stamp form and in a print form of how this was being sort of mobilized to the average Korean. Okay, so what did the WHO claim, and along with the American military, that they were doing differently? They were claiming, and this will come up in a slide or two, of course, malaria had been around for a long time. There's lots of Chosun records about this. And of course, there's an immense amount of Japanese material about this, which is the nice intersection with Alex and Aya. But they were saying that the Japanese in particular, and of course, you can see where the construction is coming here in a post-colonial nation that's just come off the Korean War, that the Japanese hadn't really cared about the Korean villagers. They only cared about the Japanese settler population, and that they hadn't really gone out to the villages. So this is really an attempt, at least to mobilize publicly, the idea of reaching out to Korean villages. On the left, what you get is a very typical thatched roof hut, a housing unit. And besides the one image I'm showing you here, lots of WHO materials about where in the houses eggs could be laid, sources of water, obviously, and trying to prevent the eggs from being laid. Lots of attention to this kind of outreach, the way that Koreans live, the way that Koreans are housed. On the right, some images from the 59 of Koreans' children lining up, being inspected, in some cases being treated in various kinds of ways. But all of this, again, to talk about the infrastructure and the idea of reaching out as much as possible. Again, in particular, implicitly, the Japanese had not done this previously, it runs the claim. Okay, a little bit more then to put this into a larger frame. And again, this is a very brief version of the talk. So when I finish up, please feel later to ask questions if there are things that you want me to expand on. There's a lot of work, as I suggested earlier, on the Chosun period, and obviously there's lots of work on the Japanese colonial period. So I've got lots of names on the left just to give you a feel for it. The person in particular highlighted in red that I want to call your attention to is Kim Jong-ran in Oxford, who has written a nice piece that's coming up in a later slide, 1876 to 1945, and very much one of the documents that I always use in kind of talking about the period prior to what I'm talking about today. And again, just to give you a couple more images contemporary to show you that it's not just malaria that's obviously gaining attention at this time. The upper right is one of the quarantine stations, I believe this is Busan, in 1945 for repatriation to and from Korea at the end of World War II, Haebang to Koreans. This was less about malaria, and this was more about cholera and other easily transmissible diseases as thousands of bodies were moving around Asia from as early as September 1945. And a recent book, bottom right, Cheongyongpyeong, Infectious Disease War, Chuncheng down below, Infectious Disease War, Contagious War, and you see a mosquito drinking from a cup of blood. This is very much a colleague in Korea, an attempt to obviously recognize that the Korean War itself was very much about dealing with infectious disease. Again, just trying to build a little bit more of a larger context for this malaria campaign. Okay. So the explanation and a quick dirty version of the context that the WHO used as well as Koreans for this time. How did it go from endemic to epidemic? Again, recognizing that it's always been around since Chosun, certainly in literature and obviously in the Japanese colonial period. It's often referred to as war malaria or malaria burden. The recognition that Japan obviously gets involved with the war in China in 1931, intensifies in 1937, war through 1945. Even though this is not fought on the Korean Peninsula, lots of bodies being moved around, with Korea being the staging grounds for much of this activity. This carries over to the American occupation, and of course, this carries over to the Korean War. So cumulatively, 1931 to 1954, almost a 25-year period, lots and lots of bodies moving around the Korean Peninsula, not a lot of attention to the infrastructure, potentially some of those bodies being new sources for the mosquitoes to infect. The mosquitoes bite them, spread it around. I mean, I'm giving you obviously kind of a generic explanation, but this is very much what's implied by the term of malaria burden or war malaria. This is being used in 1954-55 to explain the heightened numbers. And again, you can see that this is a very nice explanation if you are a WHO rep or even a Korean government rep, in that you can say, that, of course, this is a problem we can handle. We just have to pour sort of infrastructure at this. And more importantly, this is a problem to a Korean government in a very weak position that they can easily claim success from and resolve fairly quickly, or so they think. And that is, again, part of the kind of legacy of the success narrative that comes here. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this part in just a second and transition to the Vietnam part, but just again to give you the highlights of this story, again, just to make sure that I'm getting it across clearly, this is very much a WHO-led project, although of course formative Korean public health infrastructure is there. And in fact, post-Korean War is, to be honest, when a South Korean, legitimately South Korean public health network is first being built. The US military, which I mentioned earlier, military assistance program. And again, they're very much vocal about complaining about American soldiers who are obviously there after the Korean War getting malaria. So this is another voice that's there. And as I'll show in just a moment, this is domestic, but it's going to have incredibly regional implications once the Vietnam effort begins. On the left, again, just I can't resist this wonderful imagery. And you see, again, if you read the Korean, the word of Cheongyong Hanta, infectious or contagion. Malaria is, mogiga, mosquitoes are infectious, mosquitoes are contagious, and a kind of wonderfully oversized, almost comical mosquito attacking presumably innocent Korean who is looking on with kind of a shocked expression on his or her face. Okay, so this is 59 through the early 70s, but obviously only through about the middle 60s. How does this transition in what I admit is kind of a brief version of this story? Oh, sorry, one more slide before we get there. Yes. So by the late 50s, Korean parasitologists and other health officials are starting to gather and mobilize on their own. 59, as I mentioned, is the pre-survey, and that came up in some of the slides I showed you. 62 is the national program, as in stamps. This on the right is the first Korean parasite meeting of 1959. I won't call your attention to all of the names, of course, but on the left, fifth down, Chin Tak-so, and on the right, fourth down, Byung-so So. These are some of the leaders and early young Korean parasitologists. Why this is important, of course, is in just a few years, in 1965, when Korean troops go to Vietnam, these same individuals will be in charge of the perception that Korean bodies are at risk in Vietnam. Vietnam is seen very much as a kind of risky place, and Korean Yolde Wihak, or Korean for tropical medicine, is going to need to be employed. So the domestic program and the overseas program are being led by some of the same people. This is where you get the link. This is my transition. And in 1964, Koreans will form domestically what's in English KAPE, Korean Anti-Parasite Eradication. In Korean, Hanguk Kiseongcheong Pangyol Hyaphae. And if you heard the word Kiseongcheong, if any of you who don't know it, if you saw the movie Parasite last year, it's the same word. And I'm reasonably sure, even though the movie Parasite was based on contemporary economic events, I suspect that the director very much wanted to echo some of the perceptions of privation going back to the 60s. Kiseongcheong was a very common word in Korea in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so quickly, coming to Vietnam, or what I'll call the nearest faraway place, what you get again is the perception among Koreans, even though they are themselves a poor, admittedly and developing country, that Vietnam is even worse off. And what they're going to do, of course, is mobilize their medical efforts, both for Korean troops, but also for Vietnamese villagers. And this is what's very interesting. On the upper right, a Vietnamese boy receiving a free haircut, which was very much, there are thousands of these pictures, very much part of Korean village outreach. I've written about this separately, and it's probably about checking Vietnamese children, doing a head count, but also checking them for lice, checking them for cholera, because these are in villages that are in close proximity to Korean troops. Okay, having already made the link, I think, in terms of indicating that the same parasitologists in charge of both campaigns, let me try to talk about how malaria efforts and other disease efforts would fit in Vietnam. This is part of what the Americans are calling CORDS, Civil Operations Revolutionary Development Support. It's kind of a very overly cumbersome title. In Korean, this would often fit in a little more neatly in civic actions, or in Korean, Daemun Hwaldong. And at the bottom of this Korean pamphlet, again, for those of you who can read it, I won't pull out the full, but it's clearly psychological warfare. The Koreans know this. This is about Koreans placing their medical people in Vietnamese villages, usually places that are perceived as having been quote unquote pacified. In other words, combat, at least officially, is over. And sending Korean doctors to do things like neonatal care, senior care, and most specifically, my interest here, things like checking for malaria, checking for other diseases. Okay, a couple of images from that same pamphlet that I just showed you, civic actions. Again, just to give you the broader context. On the left, again, exactly one of these free haircuts, a beaming Vietnamese boy. I mean, it might be unclear from these images, but these are almost always Vietnamese children, and the Korean soldier as the barber, and a Vietnamese, and it does say in the Korean, Noin, a senior, an older guy, looking on kind of affectionately as the child receives the haircut. And again, I would argue that the haircut is very much removed from this innocent context. It's very much politicized, and it's very much about public health, and very much about probably checking the children in particular ways. On the right, a Korean soldier giving a chusa, an injection. It's not clear what drug this is. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the Korean on my screen, but I believe it doesn't specify. But you can imagine it's for some, one of the various diseases at the time. And the baby looks on kind of outraged, but the mother is kind of looking on in a beaming way. And again, these images, to really heighten the point, are all Korean. Koreans saw themselves as being perceived very affectionately. Obviously, Vietnamese voices, which are not present in my talk, would have very different things to say about this. And obviously, just need to say that because I realize looking at all these smiling faces, do not assume that this is historicized accurately. Okay, so then they come back and start taking a bigger picture look, and then starting to sort of move towards wrapping up and asking some bigger questions. Again, what I've tried to do is do a brief domestic narrative, talk about how this links regionally and then internationally. So a couple of highlights of publications and things, just to make this more clear. If 65 is when Koreans are going to Vietnam, and I suggested the links are there in terms of the personnel, by the early 70s, Koreans, along with the Japanese collaborators, are now actively starting to teach other East Asian nations, in particular Southeast Asian nations, about their collected expertise. This is called through something called APCO, and I believe Aya is going to be talking about this, the Asian Parasite Control Organization. So I just want to hint at that, but not go any further with it. More specifically, much more in detail than what I've offered you today, I recommend Sundin Yim, my colleague at Kyunghee, and Mark Harrison at Oxford. They have a wonderful article called War on Two Fronts that develops the Korean domestic program to Vietnam war program connection of public health much more exhaustively than I can do in a short talk here. And more specifically, they talk about something called COPREM, which is Korean preventive medicine. And this is very specifically putting Korean epidemiologists and Korean public health people in Vietnam during the war. What's really interesting about this is they're subcontracting through the Americans. In essence, the Americans are asking Asian actors to put their bodies on the line to gather data during the war. basically because the Americans don't want to go into high combat areas. And they asked the Filipinos to do this too as well, which is not at all here in the talk. But I should mention that Filipino health teams, because of the long relationship with the Americans, are often asked to do public health in Vietnam and other places. And I'm sure Simon knows much more about this kind of thing than I do. Okay, so let me transition again. Oh yeah, so to kind of make that connection more thoroughly, and then I come up to my one or two last slides, what does this do to return the cycle full back to Korea? In other words, domestic, you go regional, and then you bring it back to Korea. Okay, just one example. This is Yum Young Tae's dissertation on the left from Seoul National University Library. Not a particularly great screenshot, but I think it's probably you can read it. And you can see what he did, which is obviously that is a very typical PhD dissertation. You do several little studies and you knit them together. But you can see he's working on production of DDT resistance in Bangkok, plague in Vietnam, and also cholera in Vietnam. And it should be clear, if I didn't say it, again, this is all during the war. So this is probably somewhere between 1965 and about 1971, 1972. He takes this material, does his dissertation, and what he ultimately does is return to Korea. And if you read his CV and publications, which I'm not showing you, you will see lots of rural village publications by about 1975, 76, him going to industrial sites. So in other words, what I'm arguing here by implication is that whatever knowledge is gained in Vietnam as the experimental site is then kind of returning to the domestic context. And lots of these Korean guys who work in Vietnam will later go to Southeast Asia, but also domestically to kind of complete the cycle and to build the program. And that's clearly what I'm really interested in terms of building up how Korean developmental knowledge, particularly South Korean developmental knowledge, begins to accumulate. Just to kind of frame a little bit more on my second to last slide and some of the highlights of, again, the success story, but also the issues with it. Obviously, this is very much, if you just follow only the 59 to 70 story, a framed narrative that endemic to epidemic, and obviously there are problems with it when you push beyond it, which is clearly what I hope I've been making clear. And it's the international aid, military and colonial context that I find really interesting, particularly the links to the Japanese post-1965 and Vietnam, which I've highlighted some, but again, I suspect I will probably be saying something more about. The networks and the various partners I've already said a little bit about. So I'll just highlight number 4, which is I didn't really talk about today, the hardware and the technology, but very much the Koreans are interested in getting into rural villages, making these things transportable. When I heard Alex talking earlier about the train, the way the Japanese got out there with mobile things, it sounded very familiar, and I suspect the Koreans are aware of this. And this will not only be to, as I said, Vietnamese villages, but also later to Korean rural villages by the late 70s and early 80s. There's not a lot of roots in Korea until actually fairly recently. Yeah, it's very useful. And the psychology and selling of the program itself is very interesting. Again, I found it interesting that there are not a lot of posters for this particular campaign, but particularly in Vietnam, of course, I said it's much more complicated. And again, it should be kind of repeated one more time, that these villages were quote unquote pacified, meaning that the relations were probably far more problematic and fascinating and interesting. And this is something I hope to revisit in later work. So in concluding here, I want to say a couple of things and use something from my colleague and then leave you with 2 closing questions or comments. My colleague Kang Jae-ho within the last year published a piece in GIS where he was asked in the context of COVID, which is also obviously kind of in the background here, why are Koreans so good at public health, which is already a kind of a problematic question. But he said, well, it's because of emergency. He said, look, he's a communication scholar, not a historian, but he's like, look, Koreans have been dealing with these crises ongoing since 1945, some of which I hinted at, and obviously it's not just malaria, but obviously the occupation, the Korean War, even before that, war, the Pacific War. And so he says Koreans just get kind of good at these things in the sense that the emergency, waxes and wanes, but it's always there and you're always used to kind of mobilizing. I like that, but I want to go in a slightly different direction. So yeah, 2 final comments. One, when you read some of these Korean parasitologists and more of their senior work by the 70s and 80s, the thing that you see them doing all the time is essentially trying to document exhaustively all of the different parasites, kind of these flora and fauna of the Korean Peninsula approaches. So whether you call this a catalog impulse, a collecting impulse, even encyclopedic impulse, there's very much this sense that if we understand not just malaria, but all the different vectors and parasites that are on our peninsula, we will in some sense gain control over them. And this is interesting, of course, because this is not just Koreans who do this, but you can see the same publications from the Japanese in the 19-teens and the 1920s. I don't want to suggest that there's a direct link, but I couldn't help but, and again, in looking over this material again recently, hearing kind of the echoes. And Aya and I, in that one article that Aya headed and we co-wrote, definitely wrestled with this question of how do you talk about those influences without implying that the Koreans are just copying, and it's more complicated, but we wrestled with that question. The other comment, obviously, in wrapping up here, and this will be my last comment, is that very much I'm interested in not telling the success story, not telling it just as a post-Korean War story, but obviously in taking it to a story where you move from Vietnam and lead to Korean developmentalism, leading into what is known as KOICA, Korean Overseas International Cooperation, because KOICA does medical work all over the world. And the earliest, even pre-KOICA medical work for Koreans is 1968. They're sending doctors to Africa. If people are aware or not aware of this, it's more about politics and diplomatic recognition at that point. But you can see the earliest stirrings of Korean ambitions, particularly South Korean ambitions. And that's where I'll stop here and wrap up and just say, I don't have any conclusions yet, but that's exactly where I want to push this. Thank you very much. And let me close out of this. Sorry.
Thank you, John. That was fantastic.
Okay.
And like Alex's presentation, so much really rich imagery. And you maybe want to watch Parasite again and look for some of that in there too. I don't know if it's in there, or maybe he's too sophisticated to kind of make those allusions so bluntly, but it's, yeah, I'll definitely go back to that film again. Okay, moving swiftly on. Aya, are you ready? Okay, take it away.
Yeah, I hope the slides will work. Well, firstly, before I share my slides, I just want to say thanks to Paul for organizing this. This is just a great opportunity to share our work to a wider audience. So, and I think my kind of project at the moment is actually a sequel of the book that I just wrote. In fact, it's the other way around. I was actually going to write a book about Japan's position in global, population control, development aids, and global health in the mid-20th century. And then I just realized that, well, actually, in order to do that, I need to actually unpack the notion of, like population. What is population about? And why population and family planning in global health are, presented side by side, almost like as if they're kind of inseparable, units. And then, of course, that was going to be chapter 1, which turned into a book. So now I'm trying to really work on this, this topic, which I'm going to talk about, and really like John, what I'm, really like to do is, I'm really challenging also success narrative, how Japan, through international cooperation in family planning, is presenting itself and also Asia. And so that's how, that's basically the core of the presentation today. So my presentation is about an attempt to apply really the approach, I suppose already, quite a kind of seasoned approach, but in critical area studies to, analyze the position Asia as a discursive force occupied, right, in the history of global health. And yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I hope it's going to work. Please. Can anybody see? Great. Okay, fantastic. Right. Okay. So, like I said, what I'm interested. So, the Asia in Global Health is the title of presentation today, and the subtitle is Parasite Control, Family Planning, and Japanese Development Aids in 1960s and 70s. And it's more about, I think I'm talking more about parasite when it comes to parasites. History. I'm talking about parasite control than parasitology itself. But of course, there are lots of parasitologists, especially those Korean guys John mentioned, who were parasitologists, but at the same time, activists themselves. So, that, and then I'm looking at so Asia articulated by this organization you can see on the screen. The title of the organization, Asian Parasite Control Organization, and APCO, which actually John has already kindly introduced. And so APCO is so in effect it's an organization, as you can see, by the name. It was established in 1974, and it's a regional based organization sorry, promoting the eradication of mostly intestinal infections based in Asia. And now it says, I said regional organization it is, but in fact it was started by this one guy called Kuni Chojiro, the guy who I'm really concentrating for this this current project. And so Kuni is a really interesting figure. So well, I'm gonna, before I kind of elaborate on Kuni, I'm gonna just say that APCO, Kuni used APCO to really promote his development aids and health initiative called the Integration Project. And the Integration Project, or sometimes I call it IP, or they called it, contemporaries also called it IP, is an initiative that combined, parasite control with family planning and later nutrition advice. And in the early years of existence, the APCO, in fact, mobilized the transnational network in Northeastern Asia, that was originally fostered through Japan's colonial rule in the region. I'm going to elaborate on that later. And at the same time, the APCO was also stressed its Asian heritage and used certain images of Asia to promote the IP in countries across Asia. So what I want to do today with the case of APCO is that I want to argue that that Asia, as it appeared in the context of the regionally based health organization, was not just a world region that referred to a geographical area, but a concept that was constructed through a specific interpretation of local practices and historical experience. And so Asia and the regionally based health advocacy were in fact more complex than the world region, which was informed by the binaries of the global North and South, or former colonizer, the colonized, and Western and non-Western, which have a lot of currency in the historiography of development aids and international diplomacy. Right. Okay. So let's now look more closely at the Asian Parasite Control Organization. So first off, what did the APCO? How did it start? So this is where, again, then Kuni is important. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the APCO was a fruit of campaigns. In fact, deployed by Kuni himself in the, according to his recollection, right? So I'm kind of quoting what he said in his memoir and such. But so according to him, it was a fruit of his activities in the 1950s. And in the 1970s, by the 1970s, Kuni was known in two domains. One is the parasite control movement, and the second is family planning advocacy. These, domains which he, got engaged from the 1950s, in the 1950s. And so at the time when Kuni worked towards launching the APCO in the early 1970s, he was so he was not only kind of well, I think I'm going to skip that one. Okay, so I just want to give you a background information from the mid-1960s onwards. Family planning was becoming an important program in development aids and international health. Now, for instance, the prominent organizations of international governance, such as the UN, World Bank, and other major players of population, they endorse family planning as an effective measure in socioeconomic development. Now, the Japanese government in this context began thinking about this global kind of push to promote family planning in the late 1960s, and Kuni really actively supported the Japanese government from the position of grassroots health activist, and he was quite adamant actually in characterizing himself as a grassroots activist, although actually he worked quite closely with the government in effect, actually in practice. Now, getting back to Kuni and APCO, at some point in the early 1970s, while Kuni was touring around in the Philippines, he conceived an idea of merging two areas of his activism, and which he was involved so far, so parasite control and family planning. So after the Philippines tour, Kuni then laid the groundwork to materialize his idea into practice. So he used these really networks he created through his activism, especially in Taiwan and South Korea. So, for instance, South Korea. So these figures, in fact, Byung-Seol So and Yoon-Jun Lee, I think both figures actually appeared in John's presentation earlier. So they were really important figures in the domestic parasite control movement, and they were the quite, I don't know, maybe John can confirm, but quite important figures in the KAPE, right? Anyway, so in Taiwan, similar kind of figures, more kind of more health, local public health kind of figures, Wang Jinmao, Hu Huide, and Sun Bai Tun. So Kuni talked to these people and say, we should do something about parasites in parasite infections. And let's do something about it. But in fact, what he had, so that kind of leads me to another question. What did the APCO actually advocate? Now, of course, on the name, you see primarily, they were advocated to parasite control in Asia, but because of Kuni's interest in merging these, family planning and parasite control together, in fact, it doesn't appear anywhere on the title of the organization, but family planning featured quite prominently. And in fact, Kuni used the APCO as the platform to promote his idea of the IP. And so from quite early on, he proposed his idea of his philosophy, called it of the IP, and what he did was to argue that parasite control or parasite prevention could be a kind of entry point to kind of introduce family planning. So because family planning in fact is quite, as some of you know, it's quite a sensitive issue, obviously, fertility control, and it had been politicized so much by that period, and it had it had association with Nazis kind of birth control, sterilized through sterilization, involuntary sterilization. So of course this was a very sensitive issue, and there was an idea and arguments that came out not only within Asia but from within the what Matt Connolly called population establishment based in the West, that this population control, global population control realized through family planning in developing countries was quite condescending and quite kind of draconian and top down, and so Cooney knew that, and he said, well, parasite control is firstly, it's cheap to implement, and its effective. Its effect can be kind of visible straight away, and so let's just people, villagers, often the target of family planning were rural populations who suffer from, many of them, suffer from parasite infections. So why don't we combine these together? And then first, what they did, so what Cooney proposed was to say, first, use the local health practitioners or public health nurses to introduce these parasite drugs, quite different approach to what, to environmental control, but, introduce drugs and then, get rid of those parasites in the gut. And once the mothers or families see the effect of that, especially among their children, then that's a good way of, the rapport, that's a good way to kind of create rapport between health practitioners and the recipients of healthcare. And that's a good way to kind of introduce family, discussion about family planning. So, okay, so that was the IP. So Cooney used the APCO to promote that. So by October 1975, they ran APCO, the pilot projects in these areas, so South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. So the final question is, so how did the APCO promote itself and its integration project? Now, for this question, the adjective Asian in the organization's name becomes really important, because the APCO actually mobilized this adjective agent to justify its raison d'etre, and also to sell the integration project to the countries that implemented the program. So to start with, the APCO drew up the image of Asia as diseased, overpopulated, and hungry in order to set the agenda for the APCO. Now, so an example I can give you is the speech which was made, part of the speech that was made at the inaugural meeting, where founding members pointed out that parasite infection was a serious public health issue in Asia. And then, we have to do something about it. Another example was a speech given by Kishi Nobusuke, a really prominent statement, very problematic historical figure, who was actually participating quite a lot in the Japanese wing of APCO. So he was actually quite who bought this idea, Cooney's idea of the IP. Now, Kishi was invited to talk in front of the APCO, and he then argued at the second APCO meeting that the problem of overpopulation in Asia when it was combined with the low food production yield and the rising commodity price globally, then these heralded the imminent increase in the incidence of starvation in the region. And so, that would require population control via family planning. So words such as kishis were presented alongside images such as the one you see on the screen that suggested for the presence of overpopulation, hunger, and poverty in Asia. So also, when characterizing the integration project, Kuni stressed the shared tradition in the region. So for instance, when addressing the Indonesian IP pilot project, Kuni then suggested the Indonesian custom of mutual aid called gotong royong. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. So he said this mutual aid practice, this custom was a critical factor for the project's potential success. And then Kuni then compared this gotong royong to what he saw as the traditional social organization in Japan that became the basis for Japan agricultural cooperatives. Now, the Japan Agricultural Cooperatives was the biggest, agricultural organization in Japan that played a pivotal role, actually, in also popularizing family planning in Japan in the 1950s. Kuni then also said, compared. Oops, sorry. I think what did I say? Oh, sorry. Likened this gotong royong to the social organization that buttressed the South Korean Seoul Undong, which again, John can talk about it a little bit more, played again, as a rural kind of life improvement movement that promoted family planning and parasite control, or parasite prevention movement. Now, of course, in reality, all these organizations, Japan Agricultural Cooperative, the infrastructure in the Seoul Undong, and also gotong royong, and their role in the local family planning initiatives and parasite control initiatives were each unique, right? They were formed through a combination of multiple and interlinked local, national, and regional factors. But by identifying commonalities in these organizations and caricaturing them under the name of a shared cultural tradition, that had a utilitarian value for the integration project, Kuni then stressed the applicability, right, of the health program across Asia. Right? And he, in fact, the APCO actually characterized the IP in the 1980s as applicable practice, right? Applicable to all, or something like that. But so, of course, through this exercise, Asia's culture and history became quite flat. And this flat portrayal of Asia's shared tradition buttressed the APCO's activities in Asia. So just to conclude, so the rhetoric, of Asia's shared suffering and past and cultural practices form the basis of this, the inter-Asian medical collaboration under the APCO and in its early years. It also consolidated, consolidated the regional alliance, right, among the founding members from Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, which, as John and I argued in the paper Paul introduced at the beginning, was directly informed by the legacy of Japanese colonialism. So, so just wanted to say one more point or two more points that so one, I don't know. So what I wanted to say is, so Asia in the article did not merely depict the geographical orientation of the organization's mission, but in fact, Asia was also a concept that critically informed the organization's profile and program. So I'll end here. Sorry about the technical glitches.
Thank you so much. Again, the resonances, what's happening in Afghanistan, maybe I've been watching too much news, just seems so chilling, but I'm sure that Simon will talk about that with much more insight than I can. So I'll turn over to Simon now, but those of you who are watching at home or wherever you are, you can add your own questions or comments in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, not the chat box, we might not see that, but the Q&A box. And at the end, if there's time, I think there will be time, we've got a fair bit of, we've got what, over half an hour left or so. So yeah, at the end, I will read some of them out and then we can use those as a jumping off point for more discussion. But Simon, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And thank you for organizing this and inviting me. I really enjoyed all of the papers. I should say, as Paul said, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I am a historian of international development, but I'm primarily a historian of the United States and modern Vietnam. And so my perspective and my knowledge of international development is really, and I'm interested broadly in public health as a facet of international development. But my knowledge of this is really from the American archive and to an extent from the South Vietnamese archive. So I'm very open to criticism from Japan scholars if my comments come across as naive about Japanese history or historiography. But I'm really interested.
We're nice guys. We're a nice bunch here. Just safe space.
Okay, well, part of the reason why these were so interesting to me is because I am really interested in the changes in international development, especially in the 60s and 70s, and the way in which Japan and other Asian countries like Korea become kind of developer nations themselves, right? And the US seemingly steps back from some of the bilateral aid programs, or at least that's how the US what the US suggests. I thought what I wanted to do here is highlight some of the themes that I saw emerging across the three papers, and then I'll raise some questions as I move through the themes. Some are general and the panelists might wish to answer them, but some of them are specifically for individual panelists. Okay, so the first theme that I saw emerging here was the longer chronological frameworks and arguments about continuities that everyone is using here. Alex tells a story of a 100-year effort, a campaign that succeeded in the late 70s or 1980s that had its origins before World War I. And this approach that he takes really makes sense to me because the success of the project appears to be not in medical treatment or a single technical intervention, but transformation of agricultural and social practices over a long period of time. And it occurred to me, you know, that a lot of histories of development take a kind of a snapshot approach. And if Alex were to do that here, he might end up with quite a different story. For example, he could tell this as a story of about manpower mobilization in the run up to World War II, right? Because this disease was seen as weakening the nation. But that would actually be a story of failure because in Alex telling, the locals in this area remained largely indifferent to the eradication campaign by the 40s. And it's only when you take it up to the 1970s that it starts to look more like a success story. It's the accumulation of decades of changes. And I think there's a case to be made for like studying these kinds of things in a much longer chronological framework for those reasons. John's paper, John shows that his actors understood the malaria eradication campaign that began in the late 50s and 1960s in relation to the colonial period, right? So even in the midst of the Korean War, most of the health problems were not specific to the war, but had existed through and been exacerbated by Japanese imperial rule. And also by looking at this longer time frame, John is able to better understand his historical actors' expectations about the campaign. He shows us that malaria was understood in historical terms as a kind of a commonly accepted disease in Korea. It was one that peaked in the wake of colonial violence and war in the late 30s through the mid 1950s. And it was because malaria was understood as relatively common and controllable outside of these peak periods that peacetime eradication seemed like a feasible kind of project. Aya traces the career of a single Japanese health or development professional, indicating that Japan's role in international development, which really accelerates in the 1970s, has a much longer kind of origin story. APCO begins in the 70s, but emerges out of domestic Japanese campaigns in the 40s and 50s. And I know from Aya's co-authored piece with John that even these had longer antecedents in the pre-war period, right? So I think this raises interesting methodological questions about whether the history of disease and disease eradication is best studied in this longue durée perspective, not just in terms of networks of personnel, which seem particularly important in the Japanese imperial and the post-colonial East Asian context, but also in the need in Alex's story to kind of see the way in which the physical environment and human geography change over time, which has an impact on disease and disease eradication, right? And we could think about whether our historical actors understood these projects in these terms too. So I wonder, one question for people is whether they have this made a conscious methodological decision to frame these pieces in a longer time frame, and what do they think they would miss if they took more of a kind of a snapshot approach. Then the second theme that emerges for me, I think, is the kind of unit of analysis. No one here is taking the nation state as their main unit of analysis, partly because they take this longer term approach. The unit of analysis actually shifts up and down from local contexts to national, international, transnational, and even global contexts at different times. Alex is writing about something that's literally called the local disease, but the local campaigns against this illness are linked to discourses about national strength prior to World War II and national reconstruction afterwards. And this campaign also was shaped by wider discourses beyond the nation about empire. And in some ways, it's shaped by US occupation and ideas of international development in the 50s onwards. John tells us the story of the National Malaria Eradication Project in Korea, but explains that it was forged in concert with the WHO, and that we have to understand that the domestic project was also forged through Korean parasitologists' role in South Vietnam and their collaboration with Japanese and US health professionals. Aya's paper places Japanese anti-parasite campaigns in an Asian and international frame. APCO emerged out of Japanese collaboration with health professionals in South Korea and Taiwan, and organizations like International Planned Parenthood. And moreover, APCO framed its work as Asian rather than Japanese, right? So as she's told us, it presented this image of Asia as overpopulated and diseased, but with this kind of shared common sense of social solidarity in its rural social units, right, upon which the anti-parasite campaigns and family planning campaigns could build. So I have a couple of questions about these sort of perspectives. For John and Aya, how much are international factors structuring the choice to focus on malaria eradication or family planning? Are Korean and Japanese development projects being dictated or shaped to some extent by international development trends? John says that the US military perceptions of malaria in part are an explanation, and that it's WHO led. But do you think that the choice to focus on malaria eradication is due to the fact that a technical fix for eliminating mosquitoes is available in this moment, and that there's international enthusiasm for an eradication campaign, and crucially, it seems money, right? It coincides. I think the WHO's global campaign launches in 1959, if I'm not wrong, right? So it's on a very similar timescale. And so how much is the Korean enthusiasm for this to do with the fact that Korea does not have the health infrastructure in place for other approaches, and that the WHO is willing, presumably, to provide some cash. And similarly for Aya, to what extent are international factors structuring, in particular, I think Cooney's activities? I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm getting that pronunciation very wrong, but he reads very much like a development entrepreneur, right? So he's responding to trends in international development as much as he is to local development needs. And I think you could even use his career to trace the history of international development and health, right? So he's interested in parasites, then he's interested in family planning, and then he's part of the project of like internationalizing Japan's role in international development. There also seems to be interesting things to say about the NGO government relationship in his career. But with regard to family planning, is he simply kind of blowing with the international development winds, in the sense that he seizes upon this at a time when it is an issue of great global interest? And so what does that all say then about Japan or Korea's ability to act as independent developer nations, right? And so I'm particularly interested in this because, you know, as you know, I'm very sympathetic to the efforts to decenter the US and the history of international development in Asia. And so I wonder what you think about that. And then the third theme that emerges for me, all of these are presented as successes to some degree or another, though I think it was clearer, John, in your presentation than your paper that you're actually interrogating this national success narrative, right? But it is still a success to some degree. And in any case, like, I should say, success is not really a common story in the history of international development. It's a lot is written from the perspective of the US and international government organizations and Western NGOs. And it's often the story of hubris and unintended consequences, right? And so it's kind of refreshing to read success stories. So I have a question for Alex here, because his is perhaps the most successful case. What accounts for the success in your story? So many of these kinds of stories are told, as you kind of indicate in your paper, as an effort to discipline an intransigent peasantry, right, who resist. And in part because it's often told that development projects try to kind of sweep away local custom. And it's clear from your paper that the holistic approach to the problem was effective, but it does seem to hinge to a degree anyway, not just on technical solutions, but on social engineering and locals' willingness to accept medical knowledge and start treating their waste in a particular way. And it's very common in the histories I'm familiar with to say that this is the most difficult thing to achieve, right? The social engineering aspect of it. And so what explains the change in your paper from, say, the 1940s to the 1970s and the way the mindset's changed? I thought maybe your argument on this came out a bit more clearly, I think, in the presentation than in the paper, in the sense that you said that the ways in which eradication was a side effect of improved agriculture, and that was something that people could accept, and that acted as the kind of incentive. So what should we take from that, I think, is my question. Do you have to provide these kind of economic incentives to succeed? Or is there something else that explains the willingness to adapt these practices? And then finally, gender is largely absent from these papers as a topic and as a kind of a category of analysis. Women were very often the target for sanitation, hygiene campaigns, and obviously for family planning, right? And so I wondered, you know, is in Aya's story, is this why parasite control and family planning are combined? You suggest in your presentation that it was because parasite control could be an opening wedge for family planning that would presumably because it was targeting women, right? Presumably because parasite control campaigns were targeting women. Otherwise, were there specific advantages or development logics of combining these two health interventions as opposed to another combination of health interventions, right? And then I wondered if gender played a role in Alex's story too, because I was really struck by the number of examples he cites of women from outside of the area who marry local men and then develop the local disease. I wondered why it was so common for these women in particular to go and seek treatment. And I wonder, is there anything significant here to say there? So I'd leave it there, and I really commend all of the papers. I thought they were really, you know, ambitious in scope and in detail, great detail, and really important historiographical contributions from my perspective. And I'm really looking forward to the publications that emerge from these.
Thank you so much, Simon. Those were amazing, particularly your point about gender. That didn't even occur to me, but once you mention it, it's just bang, it should be front and central. So thank you for adding that, and many other good points. Does anyone want to respond to any of his excellent comments? And those of you who are listening, please do add your questions if you want in the Q&A. I can take some.
I think we all want to jump in, right?
Yeah, well, by all means, I am. If you want to go first, then
Yeah, go ahead.
The floor is yours.
No, I don't. I was the last one to present, but yeah, thank you so much, Simon, for this excellent commentary. I think I really like. Okay, so to start with, I really like your characterization of Kuni as development entrepreneur. Can I use that one for the book? I mean, he really is. I mean, that really succinctly summarizes who he is, right? So because he's been from the late 1940s until his death, he always keeps saying that his ultimate aim is human happiness and peace, of course, and so the means to reach that could be really anything, and he really cared about also NGOs making money, because and of course and also he cared about people. That's what he says. So that's that. I really like that. Thank you. So I just want to say, so for your first theme, so the question about disease, the longue durée, was that a conscious methodological choice, and what would you miss if you kind of have a snapshot, you tell a snapshot story? I think my response is that I think what I'm interested in the long term history is to really give, give a point of reference to the kind of discourses, the kind of things, Kuni or others are saying in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and saying that actually in the 50s, you're saying that in portraying, remembering the 50s in that way, but in fact, right? So I think if you look at only the 70s and look at only the 80s, I think you miss that kind of point of reference, right? And especially that's important because I do care about how memory creates reality as well in development. How Kuni and others practice practice advocacy. So that's my first response to your first question. The second is that I think Kuni. So how much international choice and dictate were shaped and or structured Kuni's of Japanese family planning, and I think quite a lot, but at the same time, it's really important to know that Kuni as well as Japanese governmental officials were quite aware that Japan of their position, right, within world politics, right. So I think so for Kuni, of course, for personally, he was using almost like a global trend to highlight his USB in a way, right? Here, Americans, and also they don't call, he didn't call it Americans, but like establishment, spreads contraceptives as if they were like candies, right? That is a really bad thing. That is an approach that is not human-centered. It's not humanitarian. I care about people, so I think he's using it to kind of like bounce off. So he was quite clever in that sense. The Japanese government, of course, they were pretty aware of their position as a kind of like developing nation or developed nation, which used to be developed, but dipped and then come back, and their position within Asia. And basically use that development international cooperation as a way to re-establish their international position. So I'll stop here. I'm gender, yes, definitely, but I think I don't want to take up too much time. Maybe I'll come back to that if we have time.
Thank you, Aya. Alex, I can see you champing at the bit.
Well, no, I'll just talk maybe a little about gender or lack thereof, and maybe plug a Japanese colleague, Inoue Hiroki's, some of his scholarship. He talks about, I think he uses women's diaries or journals to talk about post-war women's participation in these prevention campaigns. That a lot of times that the burden of attending, because there was like local health centers and these local kind of grassroots efforts to spread education. And a lot of times mothers were expected to go to these, even like younger mothers, right? But they had so much going on, right? They had housework, they had, all of these duties. And so in the journals that he looks at, there's, entries like, oh, I was going to go to the roundworm prevention talk, but I was too busy at home and I couldn't make it, or something like that. So I think definitely there's, that's part of the story, right? How did that information get back into the household? One, through mothers. And I think to kind of answer your question of what was, I don't think there's one smoking gun here in the case of schistosomiasis, or even roundworm and other parasite diseases in Japan, at least, is that there's a whole bunch of, and one of them is when you get that curriculum in the school system, where in the case of Yamanashi, they talk about essay contests, and they would put and there would be a competition for schools, the student with that wins the best essay contest, they put their essay like, they display it at the local health center or something like that. And with roundworm, it was like competitions, like schools would compete against each other to have the lowest incidence rate of eggs and parasites and things like that. So I think that's part of the story. So the gender aspect, which I kind of just briefly touch on, is super important. The story of education and children and how they bring that back into the household. And I've had people in the past say, well, when did farmers stop open defecation in their fields? And I was like, well, love to know, I don't know what the sources are for that one. It's gonna, unless I go out and interview a whole bunch of elderly farmers in Yamanashi. But my idea is that, that kids are going like, Dad or Grandpa, that's gross. We learn about that in school, right? And why these women, I guess this is my last kind of point here, why these women, outside women, I think the pattern was women would, from the agricultural or agrarian sector, women would, marry across, kind of village borders. And so they go from an outside area, and maybe up to that point, they hadn't actually worked a lot in the fields, but they get married and they're deployed by their families out into the fields, at least into schistosomiasis hotspot areas for the first time, right? And then they get infected. And there was another in the larger paper, but I didn't talk about it in the presentation. There was someone that provided oral history that worked at a local health center, and said that he would get letters from women that would say, I'm infected, and the thing with getting the shots was you had 25 shots. It wasn't like you would get them 25 days in a row. You'd get them, it would be really debilitating. You'd have to have rest. You couldn't work. And this is why it was frowned upon. And, and so mother-in-laws weren't super supportive of their young, or their son's young brides coming in, like, oh, this worthless woman, she's sick and she can't help around the house. And so it was really hard. So that was another negotiation that I think needed to to happen. Right, so that I'm assuming that local Yamanashi women would also have gotten sick, but when the historians of the local area were going in the late 70s and early 80s to collect the history of the eradication of it, because by that time it was looking like it was eradicated. I think maybe these were the more poignant stories that got recorded, was like they come from outside into Yamanashi, they get sick, no one helped them until maybe a triumphant Dr. Sugiura came to the rescue and gave them shots. So. But thank you so much for your comments. It's really, quality comments are worth their weight in gold. So many thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, just those little, even hypothetical anecdotes do give so much more texture and color and emotional weight to these struggles. John, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, really quickly too, like IXNL, I want to thank Simon, and obviously won't respond to all four. And I also wanted to throw in a plug. Actually, it was echoing with some of the questions that Paul had asked earlier in the spring. So it's a nice sort of double layer of feedback that I should give credit to. But I was particularly struck by, I'll echo Aya, Simon, in that I like this idea of Asian developer nations. And I don't know whether I want to steal it or not, but I'd like to know where you're drawing from so that I can cite. But so I'll try to answer your question by giving two quick examples. One from colleagues' work and then one from something I've written about earlier. That is, are they just simply responding to international developmental trends? And obviously the answer has to be something like yes and no, that yes, they are responding, but clearly Koreans are also kind of trying to do their own thing if they can. I'm thinking of a recent dissertation from KAIST, which has also been published in at least one article, sorry, I'm just glancing at my notes, by Kyorei Kim, and she's writing about tuberculosis or colic in Korea. But if you go through her notes and you go through her text, even though it's a largely Korean constructed argument, she's clearly drawing on lots of WHO archives. And in fact, I have to be honest, that's where I got the inspiration to go to WHO in 2019 was from her. So if you read any of the Korean historiography, it's almost exclusively about how colic and how tuberculosis was handled by Korea. It's a domestic narrative, but clearly the WHO is back there. And as you just pointed out, I would then want to know about what the WHO is doing in other countries at the time, and I suspect that one would find that there would be connections. The other one, I think Simon probably knows this and probably even knows more about it than I do, but I'll give it to you from the Korean perspective. And this is Operation Brotherhood, famously Filipinos and Filipino Jesuits connecting to Laos and Vietnam and anti-communist medical aid, sometimes written about as possibly CIA supported. Whether or not it's in that story, to the Southeast Asia story, Koreans actually do contribute. And what you will find is on the Korean side, no mention at all of these other actors except the recipient. It's 1954. There are lots of pictures of Koreans right after the Korean War shipping crates with taegugi prominently displayed on them saying to Manila. And basically what Koreans are trying to say in that story is, hey, we're just in the end of a war. We are totally devastated, but we are sending medical aid to our free world brothers. Obviously, that ends up in Laos, Vietnam, but the crates all say to Manila. I just wanted to offer that story as well as trying to emphasize, like, even in that story, how Koreans very much, 1954, and they already want to see themselves as, if not a developer nation, certainly as a donor nation. And that's really fascinating. And just to wrap up here, what I'm really trying to push against, not only in this, but in the second project, is a Korean developmentalist narrative, which largely starts in the 1990s with Koika rich nation status, when we started giving things, that omits almost everything before that, that we're talking about. And that's exactly why I love your question, because it forces me to think about all of these, like the stuff I talked about, the Vietnam stuff, that's never written in Korea as kind of being in any way connected to Korean developmentalism, whereas I think it's central. So I'll stop there. And again, like the others, thanks very much. Absolutely great questions.
Thank you, John. That's also fascinating. It's so early, 1954. I mean, that's so, I don't even know what to make of that.
The first time I saw the picture, I was like, is this accurate? It's the Filipino, it's the Korean JCs. So I imagine, I mean, it goes to Simon's question. Did someone American say to them, it might be a nice idea to give this donation? I don't know who did it, but it's mobilized as Koreans giving post-Korean War aid to the Philippines, which is going to other Asians.
Right. I mean, I'd imagine at the time they would still have been receiving huge amounts of aid from other parts of the world, right? So they're probably still net recipients,
exactly when they're
but it's
they're so-called the world's largest multilateral project.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have a sort of meandering question. I hope it's a question. about this this phrase, the development entrepreneur that Simon gave us, and it's a great term. And I have a friend of a friend who's British guy who's been in Sierra Leone for a long time now, kind of running a series of projects that are in that space in between private enterprise and sustainable finance and development. And a lot of his projects are basically tapping up the British government, like DFID, for funds. And he is absolutely pivoting to whatever the next thing is. Is it microfinance? Is it, I don't know what it is now, but like he's very much kind of tacking the trends. But at the same time, it seems like, and I could be wrong about this, but his main in is with the British government. It's a real ethnic tie. He knows people there. He knows how to do the funding application process. So he's like, there's a very obvious direct tie. And I just wondered if people like Kuni or these other people, like, are they versatile about tapping different sources of funding, or do they just go to like JICA or like one particular money tap to get the money for these different projects?
I mean, in terms of Kuni, I don't know about other, development entrepreneurs. I think that kind of, I want to actually, kind of compare, different figures. But certainly Kuni, I mean, people who know Kuni, he died in 1995, so there are still, many of them who live, who know Kuni. Say that he was incredibly energetic and entrepreneurial, right? And no, he didn't only get funding from JICA, IPPF. I mean, he basically jet setting all everywhere. He tied with later in the PRC, right? The story I want to also talk about. And so I mean, no, he was incredibly mobile and quite quick, and I don't know if it's down to his personality, or was it, was it a trend? I don't know, but he sniffed where the money was, and he could actually get the funding quite well. I think I just want to, can we get back to the question of gender? Because I think that's quite important. Like as Simon said, it's that lack thereof, is quite striking. And I think, I think firstly, I think for Alex, I have a question. Well, okay, I start with mine. Is that I wonder if for the story I want to tell, family planning is extremely gendered, right? I mean, but if you look at who is actually running the policy, who is actually running the practice, implementing the practice, who are receiving it, it's extremely gendered, right? And I think I see a really nice, in the development, field, they love flowchart. Right. So here's an international organization, national organization, and local. You see those, right, John? And you almost see, starting from men, and then trickle down, and then more and more women are there, right? And then recipients are mostly women. So that kind of gender hierarchy is almost like imprinted, like a transposed to this kind of flow chart. Right there. It's got to do with professionalization of certain scientific disciplines and healthcare disciplines. Of course, gender norm, which is, global, globally kind of, privileges men and, and etc. So that's my comment. And my question, I think I also was thinking, yes, gender, definitely. And I was thinking, for Alex, I have a question, which is that, of course, health, right, from the 1920s and 30s, as you know, discourse related to health for the nation in the Japanese context became kind of extremely gendered, right? They talk, especially in the official kind of. So I'm quite interested in how this chihobyo, this local diseases, were discussed. Was it a women's disease? Was it a man's disease? And if not, why not? I'm talking about this especially because I know that the area, Yamanashi Prefecture, was, I told you about this one, the village, one of the model villages of Aiku Mura, the imperial gift organization that focused on maternal and child health in the 1930s. Was quite active. So I'm quite interested in that, whether, whether it was talking in that term, right? Was it not an issue of maternal and child health?
Yeah, in the, the pre-war or wartime stuff, right? It's the reason that people gave a damn about it is because it affected men, local men and their ability to pass the army physical exam. So in that sense, why did they care about tuberculosis? Why did they care about beriberi? Why did they care about parasite diseases at all? It was because it affected sometimes students, but oftentimes workers and recruits. And so that was their kind of main concern in the post-war era, right? But I'd have to go back to my sources and look at the division of the incidence rates. Just kind of shooting from the hip, maybe we get more stories from women just in general because they lived longer, even though that they were sick, they lived longer to give oral history. That, farmer men probably had a shorter life cycle, whether whether it was because they smoked more or other things. I don't know. I'd have to go back, but the focus on bringing the message to school children, I think, was probably twofold. One, in a sense, to protect children, but also there had to be an understanding of this is how we get it in the house, right? That if we can't get farmers to come to the meetings that we have like every Thursday night, and the lecture and the slideshow and the lantern show and all this stuff, the other way, and I'm looking at dysentery right now in the local health centers, right? When there was an outbreak, that's what they would do. They would have nightly or weekly lectures, lantern shows, this is prevention, this is how it works, this is how it spreads. But they'd also like hammer in to the schools like the importance of washing hands. This is how you prevent dysentery. With the goal of getting it into the household. And then I have this wonderful source that you would appreciate, where the real boots on the ground heavy lifting happens when the local social worker from the health center goes to the house and says, I've seen your face at the dysentery prevention meetings. What my message, you have dysentery, you have to go to isolation. And they're like, and it's not and this source says it wasn't until the back and forth argument that finally they're convinced, and then they go to isolation. So there's also this real local heavy lifting that I think happens, and this definitely for dysentery, but I imagine for schistosomiasis as well, with the local health center deployed social workers that then fight with people and say, I saw you crapping in the fields the other day. You got to stop that, right? But that's one of the stories. Those stories are usually don't make it into the official, medical, journal articles and stuff like that. So I'm still on the look. So if anyone finds those, I'd appreciate you pointing me towards them.
Thank you. There seem to be obvious perverse incentives there about if you go to the meeting and you get sick, then you have to then quarantine, which remind me of the pingdemic in the UK that's been happening for the past few months, where people with the NHS app will get pinged telling them they've had a close contact, they have to isolate. So people just don't install the app, they take the app off their phone, and that's how we solve the pingdemic.
Or just simply ignore it.
Or ignore it. Yeah. I had a question that maybe intersects with gender. I'm not quite sure how, but especially Aya's paper, where you have these somewhat spurious arguments of a common Asian culture, made me think that, the South Korea, the Philippines, maybe Vietnam too. So, there's a big Christian population, right? Which presumably has pro-life implications, which would be quite different to Japan. I have no idea how those politics played out, but I would imagine coming up against some quite severe opposition from church leaders and kind of women's groups with a kind of Christian slant. But I don't know if that comes up in the sources or not.
That was certainly a problem in South Vietnam, where International Planned Parenthood had a local affiliate beginning in the mid-60s. And it seems, I suppose, quite perverse that South Vietnam had a population control program or a family planning program, given that vast numbers of the civilian population were being killed during the war. But there was quite a vocal group of people who were trying to promote family planning. But the problem was there was a French colonial law still on the statute books, which basically banned contraception. And the population was about 10% Catholic, but Catholics had very disproportionately large representation in the National Assembly. And this group was trying to lobby the National Assembly for several years to try and introduce family planning programs, and they were never able to get them to do it. So they had to sort of launch these. In fact, they ended up launching programs along with sanitation programs. So they would use sanitation as a kind of a way to talk to women about family planning. But because the restrictions on what they could do were so great, they could kind of only do so much, basically.
So Simon has already talked, basically just explained that situation, right? Yeah. So APCO and a Japanese organization called JOICEF, which is tying with APCO, were extremely aware of that and then careful with that, and so really stress the importance of integration. The family planning should be integrated with other public health programs. APCO went to Latin America in the 1980s onwards, and that of course became a huge problem, right? As well. In fact, more so than in the 70s, precisely because of that. But by then, that's.
If I can quickly jump in, then no, this is sounding really nice to the comparison. For the South Korean case, people famously write about the impulse for ground level activists and people during the Lee-Sung-man period, which goes, 48 through 60. But particularly post-Korean War, why wasn't there family planning 54, 55? And the usual explanation is that, a more conservative government that's dominated by a certain amount of Protestant Christianity. Why that changes in 61 with the change to Park Chung-hee is usually simplistically just described as, better organization, Park Chung-hee getting credit for doing lots of things and getting people on board. But the impulse, you will see Korean professors, activists of different stripes teaching about family planning in the 50s. And if you go all the way back, and this is the dangerous thing in Korea, but obviously as historians, we can do this, of talking about Japanese precedents, you can find Koreans pushing for family planning at what would then be Chosun Christian College, but now Yonsei University in the late 1930s under Japanese Empire. And same for my home institution, so the Keijo Imperial University, there are definitely people talking about it. It's just that usually the way Korean family planning is written is that it starts in the early 60s. But yes, absolutely. I hadn't even thought about it consciously, but Christianity, particularly in the second half of the 50s, is very much a factor, seen as a factor in kind of the delay or the kind of deferral of family planning until Park Chung-hee comes into power.
Thank you. I feel we're just getting started, but unfortunately we are out of time now. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to exercise my authority as moderator and wrap things up. But again, thank you all for this kind of do-over, and Simon for adding such a great perspective on things that has really made me think in all kinds of interesting ways. So
let me just say, Paul, before we go, that my point about gender, I said it was missing. That was because that was a comment on my paper, The Paradise of the Latrine, from which gender was also missing until one of the peer reviews very kindly pointed out that it was missing. So we're all guilty of it, but it's seems like such an important thing to consider here.
Thank you for paying it forward. We're all learning.
Well, just in case, this is being recorded, so I feel like I have to acknowledge.
Okay. Okay, well, we're hopefully groping toward enlightenment, one step at a time. But thank you for pushing us a bit further in that direction, Simon. All right, I'm going to ask Athena to if she's still there, to end things. But if you have friends or colleagues who couldn't make it, it will be uploaded on the Weatherhead website soon, so they can catch it later on. Again, thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Or evening. All right.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Simon. Thanks, Athena. Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
of course, John and I, thank you.
Bye, everyone. Yep.
Bye.